Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. I never thought I'd end up back in the Appalachian Hills, in the same valley I swore I'd only ever see in old family photos and Christmas visits, but that's exactly where I landed. After my last breakup blew my life apart, my ex and I had been living together in Asheville, sharing a little apartment above a coffee shop, and I signed that lease like an idiot after 3 months of dating, thinking love and exposed brick were enough of a foundation for a life. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Never sign a lease with someone you barely know, especially someone who seems perfect, because the version you move in with and the version you break up with are rarely the same person. When everything finally went ugly, him yelling, me crying, both of us saying things we couldn't take back, I packed my clothes in trash bags, left the furniture and most of my pride behind, and drove 2 hours north back to my parents' town, tucked into a fold of the Appalachians, a little place called Red Hollow, where the Walmart is 20 miles away, and the mountains feel like they're pressing in on you whenever the clouds hang too low. My parents' house sits at the end of a narrow road that winds along a creek and then just stops. No streetlights, just the glow of porch bulbs and the occasional headlights on the highway way up on the ridge. And even though I grew up there, coming back in my late 20s felt less like coming home and more like going backward, like I'd failed some invisible test everyone else had passed. I took back my old job at the urgent care out by the highway, the only place in town open past midnight besides the truck stop and the 24-hour diner. They were happy to have me back, told me I was a godsend because nobody wanted the overnight shifts. The 12-hour stretches where you watch the clock drift past 2 a.m., while treating sprained ankles and drunk cuts and the occasional chest pain that turns into a helicopter ride to a real hospital in another county. The trade-off for being needed was that my life flipped upside down. I slept while the town was awake, worked while everyone else was in bed, and my social life shrank down to group texts. I rarely answered and half-finished shows on my phone between patients. The night this happened, I clocked out a little after 4 a.m. The sky over the ridgeline was that dull blue. That means dawn is thinking about it but hasn't committed yet. And I was starving in that hollow way that hits you when your body doesn't know what time it is anymore. There's a 24-hour bagel and breakfast place at the bottom of the hill by the truck stop, a kind of all-purpose spot that sells everything from biscuits and gravy to chicken sandwiches. And I swung in, ordered a grilled chicken sandwich and a sad little side salad I could pretend made it healthy, and shoved the warm paper bag onto the passenger seat, promising myself I'd wait until I got home to eat. I still needed gas, though, and the only station open that hour on my route back into Red Hollow was the Shell near the river. The one with the huge, cracked parking lot that's always half lit and half forgotten. Even during the daytime, it looks like a place that belongs at 3 a.m. When I turned off the main road and rolled into the lot, I noticed something that only bothered me later. As I drove down the last stretch of highway before the exit, it kept catching a shape in my rear view. The faint suggestion of a car riding the curves a ways back with its lights off, and every time I looked harder, it was gone, like it had dropped back or never been there. I convinced myself it was just the reflection of my own taillights on the guardrail, the kind of trick your eyes play on you when you're tired and the road keeps winding. The station itself looked empty when I pulled in, just one dim island of pumps under buzzing fluorescent lights, the store glowing a weak yellow. I don't like paying at the pump at that station because the card readers look like they've survived a war. So I parked near the door, walked inside, and handed the kid behind the counter a 20 for pump 3 to save a few cents with cash. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of a man on the convex security mirror, hanging in the corner. He was standing in the snack aisle, not looking at anything, just standing there with his hands in the pockets of his dark jacket, his head tilted slightly like he was listening. By the time I glanced from the mirror to the actual aisle, Head shifted his gaze down to a rack of chips, as if he hadn't been staring at all. I told myself I was being dramatic, pushed out the door into the cool night, and headed for my car. That was when I realized I wasn't alone at the pumps anymore. A blue sedan had pulled up 2 islands over, the kind of bland 4-door you stop seeing as soon as you look away from it. And a man got out, stretching like he'd been driving for hours. He was in his late 30s maybe. Clean jeans, work boots, that same dark jacket. The overhead light carved hard shadows into his face, and there was something faintly off about his smile, like it arrived before his eyes decided whether they cared. I started fueling up, focusing on the numbers instead of asking myself why my skin felt too tight, why the back of my neck prickled under the weight of his presence. He engaged the auto lock on his pump so the gas would keep flowing without him and walked through the gap between our islands, stopping near my car, telling me he had a fun little trick to show me. Every part of me wanted to shut it down, but years of being polite kicked in. So I forced out a thin, "What is it?" and watched him demonstrate that stupid finger-pulling illusion people show kids, pretending to pull his thumb off his hand, glancing up at me as if waiting for applause. He did it once, then again, and again. His mouth curled in this almost mocking half-smile. And what scared me wasn't the trick, but the way he seemed to be studying my reaction, like he was cataloging it, like he had all the time in the world. I laughed once, a small fake sound that echoed too loudly in the hollow space under the canopy, and turned my body away to signal that the show was over. He didn't leave. He kept doing it in my periphery, fingers folding and unfolding, as if I'd asked him to keep going. My tank finally clicked full, a small mechanical mercy. I hung the nozzle back, mumbled a "have a good night" without looking at him, and practically jogged inside to get my change. When I came back out, he was nowhere in sight, but his car was still there, fuel still flowing, the hose locked in place. The passenger side door of the sedan was slightly ajar, just an inch, like someone had forgotten to close it all the way. My stomach clenched, and I did the one thing I could think to do. I checked my own back seat before I even opened my door, yanking it open, sweeping my eyes across the dark upholstery to make sure nobody was crouched there waiting. Only then did I slide in, lock the doors, and pull out of the lot, telling myself that my heart would slow down once I put some distance between myself and that place. The road from the highway up into Red Hollow climbs along the side of a hill, hugging the curves of the mountain. There are no lights, just the twin cones of your headlights and the occasional reflector nailed into a guardrail post. As I drove, I hit play on a podcast I wasn't really listening to and tried to relax, but twice, maybe 3 times as I took those tight bends, I saw light sweep across the trees in my side mirror, like another set of headlights catching up, then disappear when I straightened out. Each time I checked the rear view, the road behind me was empty, dark and slick from the mist rising from the creek, and I kept insisting to myself that I was hallucinating patterns out of nothing. It takes about 5 minutes to get from the Shell to my parents' house. I turned into our gravel drive with that strange mix of exhaustion and hunger and guilt I'd come to associate with these night shifts, and grabbed the paper bag of food, the smell of chicken and cheap dressing making my stomach ache. My parents keep a spare key in the same hiding spot they've used since before I was born, tucked behind a loose brick in the low wall by the front steps. I don't technically live there again. At least not in my mind. So they never bothered to give me my own key. And I've just gotten used to pulling up that brick, feeling around for the cool metal, letting myself in, and tucking it back. That night was no different. I felt for the key, unlocked the door quietly, slipped inside, slid the deadbolt closed out of habit, and then stepped back outside for a second to put the key away, telling myself I was being considerate. Later, my mom would point out that I didn't really look around, didn't scan the street, didn't notice anything besides the familiar creak of that brick in my hand. I went back in, locked the door again, and padded into the kitchen, setting my food on the table and moving around in that practiced, quiet way you develop in someone else's house. You avoid the squeaky boards, close cabinets softly, flick lights on at half strength. While I ate, the house felt so normal it almost hurt. The low hum of the fridge, the grandfather clock ticking in the living room, the faint rumble of my dad snoring through the vent, the black shapes of the mountains beyond the window like a wall. I pulled out my phone to scroll while I chewed and saw a notification from our cheap little front porch camera app. Wed installed it a few months earlier after some kids went through the neighborhood stealing packages. and it pinged me almost every time I came home because it recognized my motion. This alert was time-stamped 4:23 a.m., about when it'd come in. But there were two clips, one labeled "Person Detected, Front Door," and one just below it labeled the same thing 2 minutes later. I clicked the first, watched a grainy version of myself walk up, dig for the key, unlock the door, and disappear inside. The second clip showed only the door closed. Then, the faintest flick of movement at the bottom edge of the frame, like a shadow crossing the porch just out of sight, followed by the glint of something small and metallic catching the light near the step where the key hides. The video cut off before I could make sense of it. I told myself it was a glitch, that the camera had lagged or triggered late, and I tossed my phone down, annoyed at my own racing thoughts. I had just taken another bite when I heard it. The distinct, intimate sound of a key turning in the front door lock, followed by the soft click of the latch and the muted thud of the door closing again. No knock, no voice, just the quiet confidence of someone who belonged there. I froze with food halfway to my mouth, listening, my ears suddenly roaring with my own pulse. The house fell silent again. No footsteps, no coat being hung, no shoes being kicked off. I called out, my voice small in the open space, asking if it was my mom or my dad, but nobody answered. That was when the cold, animal part of my brain took over. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping too loudly against the tile, and walked to the edge of the hallway, peeking into the foyer. The door was closed, the deadbolt in the same position. It left it, no one in sight. If someone had entered, they were either in another room or I was losing my mind. I bolted up the stairs, not caring if I woke anyone, and slammed my parents' bedroom door open. They both shot up in bed, disoriented and angry, their faces going from confusion to fear as I whispered that someone had just come into the house. My dad, 65 and stubborn, swung his legs over the side of the bed and grabbed the old wooden bat he keeps leaning against the nightstand, the same one he used to threaten my teenage boyfriends with as a joke. It didn't look like a joke in his hands now. He went downstairs, turning on lights as he moved from room to room, his voice low and steady as he told us to stay close. My mom followed him and I trailed behind her, my skin crawling, half expecting someone to step out from behind every doorway. We checked the living room, the kitchen, the laundry room. Everything looked untouched, but the energy in the house had shifted like it was holding its breath. When my dad stepped outside to check the porch, he paused at the brick and then turned back toward us with a look I never want to see on his face again. He told us the key was gone. My mom hissed my name like a scolding, even as her hand shook on my arm, asking how I could have been so careless, why I didn't at least check around before putting it back. I wanted to scream that I had checked, in my own way, that had been tired and hungry and trying not to wake them. But the guilt landed heavy anyway because she was right about one thing. Whoever had taken that key hadn't guessed where it was. They'd watched me hide it. My dad kept searching, moving down the hallway toward my old bedroom and my brother's room, and when he stepped into my brother's empty room, now mostly storage and a dusty weight bench, he flicked on the light, swept the corners with his eyes, then moved on, leaving the overhead light burning behind him. I lingered, maybe because that room felt safer than the rest, maybe because I didn't want to be useless. I watched him go, then turned back inside the doorway, looking around with the uneasy sense that we were missing something. That was when I noticed the small details my dad hadn't. The edge of the curtain near the window was caught on the sill, like someone had brushed past in a hurry. The faint smear of mud near the baseboard below it, as if a boot had grazed the wall. The air in the room felt just a touch colder, like the window had been cracked open and then shut again. I crouched to look under the bed, my heart pounding, and saw nothing but dust and the forgotten leg of an old action figure. I opened the closet, half expecting someone to lunge out, but there were only boxes and hanging shirts. Relief washed over me, thin but real, and I almost convinced myself that the marks on the wall were old, that I was weaving fear into patterns. I went back downstairs, telling myself that my dad probably had it right, that whoever took the key had panicked when they heard us moving around and fled, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still occupied. that we were sharing it with someone who was simply quieter than we were. While my dad went to check the basement, a place I've always hated, with its concrete floor and exposed beams and the smell of damp earth, I stayed on the main floor with my mom, both of us hovering near the hallway like we were guarding each other. Curiosity, or maybe something darker, pulled me toward the front of the house. I walked to the dining room, the space that sits just off the foyer, the table silhouetted against the faint light leaking in from outside. From where I stood, the table looked normal, the chairs pushed in, the runner my mom insists on using even when it's just us. But the angle struck me, and I dropped to my knees almost without thinking, leaning down to look beneath. It took my brain a second to process what my eyes were seeing. A pair of boots first, planted flat on the hardwood, then denim-clad legs tucked up, knees close to a chest, and finally a face turned toward me in the dark, eyes wide and oddly bright in the thin light from the hallway. It was the man from the gas station, folded into the space under our table like a spider hiding in a crack, his body still as if he'd been holding his breath for a long time. In one hand, he clutched a small loop of gray duct tape, already torn from the roll, his fingers worrying the edge of it like a nervous tick. For a heartbeat, I didn't react. My mind just refused to accept that the same man who'd shown me a stupid finger trick a few minutes ago was lying 10 feet from where my parents slept, his boots leaving faint, muddy prints across the rug from the front door. Then everything snapped into focus, and I screamed. A raw sound that tore my throat, pulling my mom's scream up with it like an echo. My dad thundered up the basement stairs, bat in hand, and burst into the dining room just as the man scrambled out from under the table. Up close, he looked different, smaller somehow, his earlier smirk replaced by a flat, focused expression that scared me more than his fake friendliness ever had. My dad grabbed him around the shoulders, the bat clattering uselessly to the floor as they struggled. For a moment, my father's age showed, his body straining against someone at least 20 years younger and in better shape, and I watched in horror as the intruder started to twist free, his elbow driving back toward my dad's ribs. I don't know what came over me, but I lunged forward, hitting him with my fists. My mom doing the same from the other side. It wasn't coordinated or graceful, just frantic slaps and punches and grabbing at his jacket. But the sheer chaos of 3 people attacking him at once seemed to break through whatever plan Head had. He jerked away, wrenching himself out of my dad's grip, and sprinted for the door, wrenching it open and vanishing into the pre-dawn dark before any of us could catch our breath enough to follow. My dad slammed the door shut again, shoved the deadbolt into place, and dragged a heavy dining chair in front of it, while my mom called 911 with shaking hands. I stood there with my back pressed to the wall, my legs numb, tasting metal and adrenaline. The deputies arrived faster than I expected, their cruiser lights washing the front of the house in pulsing red and blue. They walked the property, took our statements, and listened as we tried to explain how a stranger who'd seen me at a gas station had ended up under our dining room table with our spare key and a strip of duct tape. They told us they'd have a car sit at the end of the driveway until dawn, just in case he tried to come back. And my dad slept, or pretended to, on the couch in the living room with that bat resting across his lap and a chair still wedged under the doorknob like some flimsy extra layer of security. The next day, he changed the lock on the front door and carried the brick from the front step out into the woods, hurling it into the creek as if that could erase the fact that our secret hiding place had never really been a secret at all. My mom announced that there would be no more keys left outside, ever, no matter how safe the town felt. For weeks afterward, every small noise in the house made me flinch, the heater kicking on, the ice maker dropping cubes, even the wind pressing against the siding sounded like footsteps or a hand on the door. And every time I drove that stretch of highway at night, I checked my mirrors obsessively, searching for phantom headlights I wasn't sure were ever really there in the first place. I feel a heavy guilt for being the one who led him here, for not trusting my instincts in that gas station parking lot, for letting a stranger turn a long, quiet night shift into something we still talk about in hushed tones when the power flickers and the valley goes dark. And even though I know logically that the blame is his, that he chose to follow me, to watch me, to take that key and hide under our table with duct tape in his hand, I still replay every choice I made and wonder which small decision could have changed the outcome. I've requested not to work overnights anymore, and I'm looking for apartments closer to a city again. Somewhere the darkness feels busy instead of empty. But that night in the hills changed the way I move through the world, the way I see strangers at gas stations and empty parking lots and spare keys tucked into obvious places. If you've ever had a moment where your gut told you something was wrong and you ignored it, I'd honestly like to hear what happened. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. Because part of me is still there in that quiet kitchen at 4 a.m., hearing a key turn in a door that was supposed to be locked. Story 2. My name is Caleb, and I grew up in a little Appalachian town. You'd miss, if you blinked, driving past it. A place pressed tight between two ridgelines where everybody knows whose truck is whose by the sound of the engine, but no one knows what to do with you when you say you want anything more than a shift job and a fishing license. Maybe that's why I fell in love with driving at night. With the feeling of slipping out of that narrow valley while everyone else slept, the state lines and mile markers rolling by, like proof that my world could be bigger than one hollow cut into a mountain. I've always hated traffic with a ridiculous kind of passion. The stop-and-go misery of Knoxville at rush hour or downtown Asheville when the tourists clog the streets. So when I decided to spend a full month helping my cousin renovate his place outside Atlanta, I knew he'd be driving, not flying. And I knew he'd be leaving before sunrise, long before the morning commute turned the interstate into a parking lot. I left my parents' driveway a little after 2 a.m. The house dark behind me, the air cold and damp in that way. It gets in the hills even in warmer months. The holler was so quiet I could hear the creek down below, and the last few cicadas buzzing half-heartedly in the trees. I grabbed a big gas station coffee in town, the kind that tastes like burnt plastic but somehow feels like armor when you've got hundreds of miles ahead of you, and I merged onto the interstate with that jittery mix of caffeine and adrenaline humming in my veins. The first hour or two of driving through the mountains at night is its own strange kind of beauty. The highway snakes along the sides of ridges and dips into valleys, and your headlights carve out this small bright tunnel in front of you while everything else is just shadow layered on shadow. But as you get farther south, out past the stretches I know by heart, the road starts to feel different, less like home and more like a long, dark corridor where anything might be standing just beyond the reach of your lights. Somewhere after 3 a.m., as I crossed from one state into the next, I started to get that hollow hunger that hits when your body remembers it's supposed to have breakfast even though the clock says you should be asleep. I told myself I'd stop at the first exit that promised food, and a few miles later, there it was. One of those tall blue signs listing gas, lodging, and a handful of fast food places, glowing out of the darkness like a promise. I took the exit, following the smaller signs down a 2-lane road that peeled off from the interstate and curved through a patch of nothing, just trees, a few distant porch lights up on a ridge, and a wide strip of black sky with no town glow anywhere. As I eased down the ramp, my headlights swept over a big old billboard that made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't immediately name. It was one of those missing boards, the kind that shows a rotation of faces. But this one was weathered and peeling, some of the photos half torn away or scratched out, leaving ghost outlines of where eyes and smiles used to be. Fresh paper had been stapled over some of the older posters, but the edges curled, and when my lights passed over, it looked like the faces were shifting again and again. A whole collage of people who had once driven out here and never made it home. I remember thinking it was a creepy thing to see at 3-something in the morning on a lonely exit. And then I told myself I was being dramatic, that those boards are everywhere if you're paying attention. The fast food place was behind an old gas station, a low beige building with a drive-through lane that hooked around the back. Its parking lot lights were half burned out, the few that worked flickering in a way that made the shadows jump. Only one other car was in the lot, a dark sedan parked near the side of the building, facing the tree line beyond the asphalt. The restaurant's drive-through menu was lit up, bright and crisp with pictures of breakfast sandwiches and coffee. So I pulled into the lane, rolled down my window, and stared hopefully at the intercom, waiting for that tired voice to crackle to life. Nothing happened. I sat there for a full minute, then another, listening to the engine ticking and the high, thin buzz of the fluorescent lights. To my left, The windows of the building were dark, but at one point my headlights angled just right and I could have sworn I saw a shape standing motionless just inside the glass, tall, still, like someone watching the parking lot from behind the counter. When I blinked and looked again, there was nothing but my own reflection in the glass and the faint outline of drink machines. I tried to laugh it off, pulled out my phone, and looked up the restaurant's hours. And there it was in black and white. They didn't open until 6 a.m. I sighed, told myself it'd have to find some other place farther down the road, and that was when it happened. 3 sharp knocks on my driver's side window, loud enough in that dead quiet that my heart jumped into my throat. I turned my head and saw a man standing there, close enough that I could see the stubble on his jaw and the way his breath fogged faintly in the cold. He was smiling, one of those easy, practiced smiles that never quite reached his eyes. And he made a little motion with his hand, like he wanted me to roll the window down. Every instinct I had was telling me no, so I cracked it just enough to hear him. He said the place wasn't open yet, that he'd been sitting there waiting too before he checked the app. And I nodded, showing him my own phone like proof that we were both just hungry and disappointed. Then he launched into his story. His car, he said, was dead. He pointed to the dark sedan in the corner and explained that his battery had died while he was waiting, that he was stranded out here with no jumper cables and no one else around. He said he'd been trying to call a friend, but nobody was answering this early, and asked if I could give him a jump, insisting he had the cables in his trunk so it would be quick. I remember this strange tug-of-war happening inside me on one side. All the times my dad told me, you don't leave someone stranded on the side of the road if you can help it, especially not in the middle of the night, in the mountains. On the other, that same cold instinct from the parking lot making the hairs on my arms stand up. I took another look at his car, sitting by itself near the tree line, and I reminded myself that I believe in karma, in trying to be decent even when it's inconvenient, and I thought about how much it would eat at me if I drove away and later learned something terrible had happened to him. So I swallowed my unease and told him it'd help. He stepped back so I could pull out of the drive-through lane and swing my truck around next to his sedan. We lined up hood to hood, the 2 vehicles forming a barrier between the lit parking lot and the dark fringe of woods. He popped his hood and I killed my engine, stepping out into the cold air, the silence around us settling heavy. Up close, I could see more details. His clothes were clean but worn, his jacket frayed at the cuffs, his eyes constantly flicking past me toward the entrance to the lot as if he were waiting for something. We hooked up the jumper cables, red to positive, black to negative. Everything exactly the way my dad had taught me years ago in our driveway back home. I started my engine, letting it idle, and we gave it a minute. He walked around to his driver's side, got in, and tried the ignition. The engine whined but didn't catch, then fell silent. We agreed to wait a little longer. While we waited, he wandered a few steps away and pulled out his phone, turning his back slightly, speaking into it in Spanish in a low, urgent tone. I don't speak more than a few words, so the meaning was lost on me. But the rhythm of it, the quick bursts, the pauses felt wrong, like he was giving directions rather than asking for advice. When he came back, he said his friend had suggested waiting just a few more minutes and trying again, and I nodded, though my patience was wearing thin. The night had gotten quieter somehow, the steady drone of interstate traffic distant and muffled. I realized I couldn't see any headlights on the road that lay beyond the small rise of trees separating us from the highway. And for the first time, the whole place felt cut off, like we were on an island of cracked asphalt in a sea of dark woods. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl in a subtle, almost physical way. On the far edge of the lot, just beyond where the patchy light ended, there was a shape on the ground near the chalky line of the shoulder, a small heap of fabric and something reflective. When my headlights shifted, I saw it was an old safety vest, ripped down the middle, the reflective strips dulled and scratched, half buried under gravel. Next to it lay what looked like a broken phone case and a single sneaker, the laces splayed out like fingers. It could have been trash, the leftover remnants of some long-ago breakdown. But seeing it there, in that empty lot, with this stranger asking for my help, made the whole scene tilt slightly toward nightmare. I was starting to think that it'd done enough, that it was time to disconnect and move on when I heard it. The sound of engines revving hard, 2 of them coming fast. The noise rose from the road beyond the trees, then exploded into the lot as 2 pickup trucks swung in from opposite sides of the building, their headlights and high beams flooding the asphalt with white light. They moved with purpose, no hesitation, one sliding in behind my truck and the other angling itself diagonally so that together they formed a wall of steel and light behind me, blocking my path back to the exit. In that split second, everything clicked into place. The man with the easy smile, the low conversation in a language I didn't understand, the lone car in the corner, the isolated exit, the torn safety vest, the missing faces on the billboard, and I knew exactly what kind of story I was suddenly inside. I pulled the jumper cables off my battery with shaking hands, letting them dangle from his car, slammed my hood shut, and hit the lock button on my key fob until I heard my doors clunk. I didn't wait to see what they were going to say or do. I turned and sprinted straight for the tree line, vaulting the low concrete curb and pushing my way into the dark. The woods swallowed me in seconds. The light from the lot fell away behind me, replaced by the tangled silhouettes of branches and the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. The ground under my boots was uneven, rutted with roots and rocks, and I stumbled almost immediately, going down hard on one knee, the sharp edge of a broken branch catching my shin and tearing the skin. I bit back a cry, forced myself up, and kept moving. Behind me, I could hear voices, 3, maybe 4 men shouting in Spanish and English, their words scattered but their tone unmistakable, angry and urgent. The sound of doors slamming, feet hitting pavement, and then the thunk of someone kicking at my truck's doors and windows. Then the shrill blast of my own car alarm cut through the night. I dropped low, crawling now, using my hands to feel ahead. My palm brushed against something smooth and cold, and when I squeezed it, I realized I had grabbed a plastic zip tie. Several more lay scattered around it, some still looped in loose circles, others cut open, along with a length of duct tape stuck half-heartedly to the ground, dirt clinging to the adhesive. A few feet away, almost hidden under a layer of leaves, was a wallet empty, the leather warped by rain, all the cards and cash gone. Only a clear plastic sleeve with a faded photo still inside, a stranger's face smiling up at me. His name blurred, but the state on his ID unmistakably from a few hours north of here. It hit me then that I might not be the first person who'd been lured off that exit and into that parking lot. And that thought alone made my breathing go shallow and fast. I lay as flat as I could, pressing myself against the damp earth, trying to force my body to become part of the forest floor. The men's voices drew closer, the crunch of underbrush coming from different directions, their flashlights casting moving beams of white that sliced between trunks. Each time a beam passed near me, I held my breath so hard my chest hurt. I could hear one of them muttering in English that I couldn't have gotten far, that they'd seen the direction I ran. Another answering in Spanish with a low curse. Time stretched thin in those minutes. I remember every sound distinctly, the snap of a twig under a boot, the rustle of leaves under my own slow, shaking movements as I shifted my weight inch by inch to avoid being silhouetted, the distant, maddeningly normal sound of a truck downshifting on the interstate far away. Eventually, the voices began to recede, their frustration bleeding through, the beams of their flashlights moving farther away as they swept wider circles through the trees. When the woods fell silent again, except for the chirping of insects and my own ragged breathing, I let myself believe, just a little, that they'd given up on the idea of finding me in the dark and gone back to the easier victim. My truck and everything he'd packed into it. The car alarm had stopped. Its sudden absence left a hollow in the night that felt almost heavier than the noise had. I stayed where I was, counting slow, deliberate breaths until my hands stopped shaking enough for me to push myself up into a crouch. From that low position, I crept back toward the edge of the woods, careful not to snap any branches, my heart hammering as the faint orange glow from the parking lot grew through the trees. When I reached the tree line, I stayed hidden, peering through a gap in the brush. The lot was nearly empty. My truck sat alone under the flickering lights, its rear passenger window a glittering hole, shards of glass scattered on the asphalt. The dark sedan was gone. Both pickup trucks were gone. The place looked like it had looked when I first pulled in, except for the broken glass, the open tailgate, and the fact that the world I thought I lived in had quietly shifted on its axis. I ran across the lot, my shoes crunching over glass, and looked into the cab and the bed. It was worse than it expected. They'd taken almost everything, my duffel bags packed with clothes, my suitcase, the backpack where I'd stuffed my watches and the few pieces of jewelry I owned, even a box of tools and the beat-up old guitar I'd been playing since high school. The glove box hung open and empty. My insurance cards tossed on the floor. My registration bent. It felt like someone had taken a vacuum to my life and sucked out all the parts they'd chosen to bring with me. I felt something in me just crack under the weight of it, the adrenaline, the fear, the sense of violation, and I found myself standing there in that lonely mountain parking lot at 4 a.m, bleeding from my leg, shaking from cold and shock, tears stinging my eyes in a way I hadn't felt since I was a kid. I called 911, my voice not sounding like my own, and told the dispatcher everything. The exit number, the fast food lot, the man with the battery story, the 2 trucks, the woods, the things Id found on the ground. The officers who showed up were local county guys, tired-eyed but kind. They took my statement, asked the same questions in a few different ways, and told me they'd pull the security footage from the cameras mounted on the gas station and the restaurant once the managers came in. One of them walked me around the truck, shining his flashlight from different angles, and shook his head in a way that said this wasn't the first time he'd seen something like this. He told me quietly that sometimes groups like that use fake plates or no plates at all, that they move fast, hit travelers in lonely spots, and are gone long before anyone can get a good description, that the mountains hide a lot of things if you know where to look. They said I didn't need to stick around in town, that they'd contact me when they had more information, but there was something in their tone that suggested I shouldn't expect much. I was only a few hours from home at that point, so once they'd swept up enough glass for me to safely drive and Id taped a trash bag over the broken window, I turned the truck around and headed back north instead of south, the way Id just come, retracing my own route in reverse. That drive home was one of the longest of my life, even though the miles themselves weren't many. The wind forcing its way through the torn plastic in the window sounded like whispering, and every set of headlights in my rear view felt like a threat until it passed me and disappeared over the next hill. A couple of days later, the sheriff's office called to tell me what I already knew in my gut. The sedan's plates were fake, and the cameras had caught very little that would help, just bright flares of headlights and a few shadowy figures moving in and out of frame. No one had identified them, and my stuff, my clothes, my guitar, the small, personal pieces Id stuffed into bags was as good as gone. I tried to tell myself that I did the right thing initially, that I was just trying to help someone who said they were stranded, that the cruelty is on them, not me. But it changed me. Now, when I see those blue exit signs promising food and gas in the middle of nowhere, I don't feel comfort. I feel wary. I think about that torn safety vest, that empty wallet in the leaves, the scratched out faces on that massive billboard as I came down the ramp, and I wonder how many stories started on that same exit with someone just like me, thinking they were doing a small good thing for a stranger. I still believe in karma in some abstract way, but I also believe in listening to that low-level static in your gut when something feels wrong, because that night in the Appalachian dark taught me that not everyone who smiles at you in a lonely parking lot is grateful you stopped. And not every plea for help is what it seems. If you've ever ignored your instincts for the sake of being nice and it came back to bite you, or if you've been in a situation on a back road or an empty exit that still haunts you, I genuinely want to hear it. Drop it in the comments, because part of me is still out there at exit 47, engine running, trying to decide whether to stay in the truck or step out and be the good guy. Story 3. My name is Ryan, and I used to think the scariest thing about a long solo drive through the Appalachian Mountains was just staying awake. Now, when I think about that night on the interstate, What sticks with me isn't the fatigue or the empty road, but the feeling that I was brushing against the edges of somebody else's hunt without realizing I was the one being weighed and measured. I was driving from southern Ohio down to eastern Tennessee, cutting across the spine of the Appalachians on a 15-hour trip to help my sister move into a little rental outside Johnson City. Money was tight, flights were ridiculous, and I figured a long drive with some podcasts and gas station coffee would be almost therapeutic. I left late on purpose, because I hate traffic with a weird, personal kind of hate. And those mountain interstates are pure misery in daylight when trucks crawl up the grades and everyone stacks behind them. At night, though, the highway turns into this quiet, endless ribbon weaving between dark ridges. And for the first few hours, I almost enjoyed it. The farther south I got, the fewer cars I saw, until there were stretches of 10, 15 minutes where it was just me, the white lines, and the occasional glow of a distant house way up on a slope. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, somewhere on a stretch of interstate that cut through national forest, the need to pee hit me hard, the kind of urgent discomfort that makes it impossible to focus on anything else. My eyes started scanning the side of the road for that familiar blue sign announcing a rest area. When it finally appeared in my headlights, rest area 2 miles, I felt an absurd wash of relief. Then, a second, smaller digital sign beneath it flicked on as I passed, a temporary highway board that read, in glaring orange letters, U.S. Caution, criminal activity reported in area. I told myself it could be anything, a car break-in, a stray report, something already resolved. Still, my fingers tightened on the wheel as I took the exit. The ramp curled into the trees, and the rest area came into view, small and lonely. A narrow parking lot, a squat concrete building that housed the bathrooms, a couple of vending machines with their fronts glowing weakly. Only one car was there, a dark SUV parked nose-in near the far end, facing the woods instead of the building, its taillights faintly pulsing like it had been recently occupied. As I pulled into a spot closer to the entrance, my headlights swept over the bulletin board mounted by the sidewalk, and I caught a glimpse of layered flyers and notices. The top one was a missing persons flyer, the paper wrinkled from weather, the photo of a young woman starting to run at the edges. Behind it, I could see other flyers, edges curling, all with the same blocky missing at the top. In the moment, I told myself it was just a coincidence, that every rural rest area has those boards. Still, it unsettled me in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. I stepped out of my car, stretched my stiff legs, and started toward the building. The air was cold and damp, and there was that deep mountain silence that feels like the night is pressing right up to your eardrums. As I walked past the SUV, I glanced over out of pure curiosity. The windows were tinted dark, but I could see the faint outline of something long and lumpy stretched across the back seat, covered loosely with a cheap blue moving blanket. One corner of the blanket had slipped, just enough to reveal what looked like a heavy work boot underneath, lying on its side, though the sole faced the wrong way for how a person would lie. I told myself it was just gear, maybe tools or hunting equipment, and forced my eyes forward again. Inside, the restroom was lit by harsh fluorescent lights, the kind that make everything look a little sickly. The smell of disinfectant only half covered a sour, human smell that lingered beneath it. What caught my attention first, though, was the man. He was standing in the far corner of the tiled room with his back to me, head tilted slightly downward, his hands at his sides. For a split second, I thought he might be using a urinal I hadn't noticed. But there was nothing there. He was just facing the blank corner, inches from the wall, as if he'd been ordered to stand there. I froze in the doorway, that rational part of my brain trying to slap a normal explanation over what I was seeing. Maybe he was sick, maybe he was drunk, maybe he'd had some kind of episode, and another part of me telling me in very simple terms that I should leave. I didn't say anything. Talking felt like it would break some fragile surface tension and draw his attention to me. I stepped past him as quietly as I could, heading for the stall, my heart beating in a way that felt too loud in that hollow room. As I walked by, I couldn't help but notice details. His clothes were plain but clean, jeans and a gray hoodie, his hair cut short, his hands hung loose, but the skin on his knuckles looked scraped, like he'd punched something recently. little raw patches catching the light. On the floor near his right boot was a crumpled plastic hospital bracelet, the kind they print your name and date of birth on, snapped open. The printed side was face down, so I couldn't read it, but the sight of it in a rest area bathroom at 3 a.m, next to a man facing the wall, sent a shiver down my spine. I ducked into the stall, shut the door, and tried to will myself to relax enough to actually use the bathroom. I'm one of those people who freezes up if someone else is in the room, and this was like my personal nightmare. Total silence. A strange man standing in the corner, my own breathing sounding too loud. I stood there for what felt like forever, unable to go, painfully aware of every little sound, pipes creaking, a fly buzzing near the flickering light. Finally, I gave up, flushed the toilet just to make a normal noise, and unlatched the stall. When I stepped out, the scene had changed in the smallest but most horrifying way. The man was still in the same spot, but he had turned around. He was now facing me directly from across the room, standing exactly where he'd been, his back no longer to the corner, his eyes locked on mine. I hadn't heard him move, not a single footstep, and it was like he had simply rotated in place while I was in the stall. His face was ordinary in the way that's hardest to describe, but his eyes were wrong, too wide, too flat, the expression in them empty, like he was looking at a point slightly behind me instead of at me. His mouth was closed, his jaw tense, his chest barely moving. He didn't speak. I didn't either. I just felt that primal rush of fear, my body surging into a fight or flight response I hadn't chosen. I turned and walked straight out of the bathroom, my pace controlled until I hit the outside air, then speeding up as I headed for my car. As I reached my vehicle and fumbled for the door, I glanced back over my shoulder. The restroom doorway was empty. For a second, I couldn't tell if that made it better or worse. I got in, locked the doors as fast as my fingers could hit the button, and backed out of the space. As I drove toward the exit, back onto the interstate, my headlights swung over the SUV again, and I saw something that would only register later. The rear hatch, which had been closed when I walked in, was now cracked open by an inch, like someone had popped it but hadn't yet lifted it all the way. I merged back onto the highway, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I still had hours to go, and the problem was, I still needed to use the bathroom. My body hadn't stopped needing relief just because my brain was on high alert. I told myself I could make it another 20 minutes, maybe 30, until the next rest area. As I drove, I tried to calm down by focusing on the road, on the reflective markers sliding by. Every now and then, I checked my mirrors, a little compulsively. For a long stretch, there was nothing behind me but darkness and the slight glow from my own taillights on the guardrails. Then, after a curve where the interstate hugged the side of a mountain and opened briefly to a long, descending straightaway, I saw a pair of headlights in the distance, far back, just cresting the previous hill. They were steady, not gaining fast, not falling behind, just matching my pace. I watched them for a while, telling myself that it was perfectly normal for another car to be out at this hour. At some point, as we dipped into another long curve, those lights vanished behind the rock wall, and when the road straightened again, they didn't reappear. It was like the car had peeled off onto some unseen exit that I'd missed. I tried to let it go. About 20 minutes after leaving the first rest area, another blue sign appeared, rest area 1 mile, and I actually sighed out loud in relief. This one was almost a mirror copy of the last. Small, tucked into the trees, a single building, vending machines, a couple of picnic tables with their tops slick from dew. The parking lot, though, was empty. No semi-trucks idling, no cars with sleeping families, no one. Normally, I'd consider that a plus. Now, it just meant that if anything went wrong, there was no one else to accidentally interrupt it. I pulled into the spot closest to the building, my headlights washing over the door. The glass panes were fogged slightly from the temperature difference inside, and for one brief second, I saw the outline of a handprint smeared across the inside, the oils catching the light. It looked fresh, the streaks not yet fully dried. I told myself it meant nothing, grabbed my keys and phone, and headed in. The interior was almost identical to the last bathroom, the same tile, the same fluorescent hum, but it smelled different here, less like cleaning chemicals and more like metal and damp fabric. The automatic lights flickered when I walked in, as if they'd had to think about whether to activate. This time, there was no one in sight. The urinals were empty, the sinks dry, the stalls closed. I hurried into the nearest stall, latched it, and finally, my body decided to cooperate. The relief was immediate, almost dizzying. As I finished and zipped up, the door to the bathroom opened with a soft mechanical sigh, followed by the shuffle of footsteps on tile. I expected to hear the screech of a stall door or the sound of someone at the urinal, but instead, the footsteps came straight down the row and stopped right outside my stall. I froze. Through the gap at the bottom of the door, I could clearly see a pair of shoes. Heavy work boots, dark with lighter, worn-out soles. One of them scuffed at the toe. My brain supplied an image it didn't want to. The same kind of boot it seen under that blue blanket in the SUV, the same boots the man in the corner had been wearing. The boots were positioned toe forward, pointed directly at the stall, not angled like someone casually waiting their turn. Whoever it was stood there perfectly still. I waited for them to say something, to cough, to move. Nothing. The quiet grew heavy, the only sound, the faint buzz of the lights and the echo of my own heartbeat in my ears. I'm not proud of it, but my social anxiety kicked in hard. Some part of me was more afraid of confronting a stranger with a question than of what that stranger might be planning. I stared at those boots and tried to gather enough courage to speak. Before I could, my phone, which I'd left in my pocket, buzzed softly, just a notification from some app. But the familiarity of that little vibration grounded me. I realized, with a sick clarity, that I could use it to create some kind of leverage. I unlocked the screen with shaking hands, pulled up the keypad, and dialed 911. When the operator answered, I put the call on speaker and held the phone at chest level, making sure my voice would carry. I told the dispatcher, in a loud, clear tone that felt unnatural coming out of my mouth, that I was alone in a rest area bathroom off the interstate in the Appalachians, that someone had followed me from another rest area, that they were standing outside my stall and I felt like I was in danger. I made a point to repeat the location and the words, dangerous man and being followed, not just for the dispatcher but for the person on the other side of the door. As I spoke, I watched the boots. For a long 2 or 3 seconds, they didn't move at all. Then, finally, they shifted, one foot stepping back, then the other, the toes pivoting away from the stall. The footsteps receded, slow but steady. I heard the bathroom door open again, the soft whoosh of the air pressure changing, then closing. I told the dispatcher what had happened and said I wanted to wait in the stall until someone arrived, because stepping back out there felt like stepping off a ledge in the dark. They stayed on the line, their voice a calm background hum while my eyes kept flicking down to that bottom gap, half expecting the boots to reappear. When the knock finally came at the main bathroom door, firm and accompanied by someone announcing themselves as Highway Patrol, it was like breaking the surface after being underwater too long. I unlocked the stall, stepped out on legs that felt unsteady, and walked to the entrance. The officer on the other side was middle-aged, tired, but alert. He stood slightly to the side of the doorway, not directly in front of it, which told me he was used to thinking about worst-case scenarios. We walked out together, and the first thing I did was look at the parking lot. My car sat alone under the lights. No other vehicles. No dark SUV, no shadowy sedan, nothing. The officer did a quick sweep of the building and checked the surrounding area while I leaned against my car, the adrenaline starting to drain away and leaving me exhausted. He asked me to describe the man he'd seen in the first bathroom, his clothing, his build, the SUV, the boots, the hospital bracelet. When I mentioned the digital criminal activity sign and the cluster of missing person flyers at the earlier rest stop, something in his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He didn't share much, but he did say that there had been incidents at a few mountain rest areas over the past couple of years, car break-ins, assaults, people reporting being followed, and that they were trying to step up patrols, especially at night, but they had a lot of miles of road to cover and not many bodies to cover it with. Before he let me go, He walked around my car with his flashlight, checking the doors and windows. On the passenger side, near the back door, he paused and leaned in closer. There, smudged on the glass, was a partial handprint, like someone had rested their palm against my car and then slid it down slightly. It could have been from a gas station earlier, from me, from anywhere. But the way the officer's jaw clenched as he looked at it told me he was thinking the same thing I was, that between the first rest area and the second, someone might have walked up to my vehicle in the dark, tried a handle, maybe just tested the waters. He didn't say it out loud, he just wiped at the print with his thumb until it smeared away and told me to be careful, to consider skipping the rest areas for the rest of my trip and sticking to well-lit exits with 24-hour gas stations instead. I got back on the interstate with a patrol car in front of me for the first few exits, watching its taillights until they eventually took an off-ramp and left me on my own again. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but uneventful doesn't mean forgettable. I checked my mirrors constantly, flinched at every pair of headlights that appeared behind me, and avoided stopping unless it was absolutely necessary. What really stayed with me afterward wasn't just the creepiness of a man standing in a corner or a stranger's boots outside my stall. It was the realization that there are people who look at a lonely bathroom in the mountains at 3 a.m. and see opportunity instead of vulnerability, who don't care if you're male or female, strong or nervous, tired or alert, they just see a target. I'm a guy, and it always quietly believed that the really scary things, the being followed stories, and the bathroom horror stories, mostly happened to women. That night scraped that naive layer off and left me with a different, harsher understanding. These days, when I see a blue rest area sign on a long trip, I don't feel relief anymore. I feel my stomach tighten just a little. I think about that man in the corner, that SUV with the half-open hatch, the hospital bracelet on the floor, the boots outside my stall, and I ask myself whether a few minutes of comfort is worth stepping into a place that feels like the edge of the world. If you've ever had something happen to you on the road, a rest area moment, a gas station encounter, sometime you felt watched or followed and couldn't quite explain it, I honestly want to hear it. Drop your story in the comments, because part of me is still standing in that stall with my phone on speaker, hoping that being loud about my fear was enough to make whoever was on the other side of the door decide I wasn't worth the risk.